There's a particular kind of darkness that exists within the walls of civilization, not the comforting darkness of night, but the hollow, choking darkness of confined spaces where children once crawled like insects through the arterial network of Britain's homes. The Chimney Sweepers Apprentice, a fragment of humanity compressed into architecture's most desperate spaces, represents perhaps the most grotesque intersection of industrial progress and human expendability ever conceived. 6 years old? Let that sink into your consciousness for a moment. 6 damn years old. That's when they decided a child was ready. Not for kindergarten, not for bedtime stories, but for being stuffed up the toxic intestines of British architecture, lungs filling with carcinogenic soot, while their small bodies were scraped raw against brick and mortar. The story begins around 1200, when Britain replaced open fires with chimneys. For 4 centuries, rooms got specialised, spaces got smaller, and sea coal replaced wood, depositing layers of flammable creosote that demanded regular cleaning. Then came 1666 and the Great Fire of London, bringing building regulations that created angular, labyrinthine, and impossibly narrow chimney flues. The standard domestic size, 9 inches by 14 inches, measurements that would become the confines of childhood hell for generations. This is where our story splits from architectural history into something far more sinister, a fever dream of child trafficking dressed up as legitimate business. Orphans and paupers, society's most disposable assets, were signed over by parish officials to master sweeps through indenture papers approved by magistrates. For poor law guardians, each child apprenticed meant one less mouth to feed. For master sweeps, it was cheap labour. For the children, a freaking death sentence stretched out over years of torture. The price of a child ranged from 7 shillings to 4 guineas. 6 was considered the ideal age for training, young enough to be mouldable, small enough to fit the narrowest passages. Though Lord Shaftesbury once encountered a chimney sweep aged 4. The process was methodical abuse. The master would fix a cloth over the fireplace. The boy would strip down, sometimes completely naked if the chimney was particularly tight, a practice grotesquely called buffing it, pull his cap over his face and hold his brush above his head. Using back, elbows and knees, body wedged diagonally, the child would shimmy upward in a caterpillar-like motion. The brush would dislodge soot that rained down over the child's body. The scraper would chip away at hardened creosote. Having reached the top, sometimes 4 or 5 stories up, the child would slide back down at speed, landing in toxic waste. Then they'd bag up the soot, 9 pence a bushel in 1840, and carry it to the master's cart. 4 or 5 chimneys a day, every day, for years. Fresh apprentices had a particular problem. Their skin wasn't tough enough. The solution? Stand them close to a roaring fire and rub strong brine into their wounds with a brush, every night until the skin hardened. This wasn't medical treatment, it was seasoning human flesh for further abuse. These children received no wages. They slept black, bedding down unwashed beneath soot-filled sacks on cellar floors. Washing was an occasional luxury. Weekly if they were lucky, but one Nottingham sweep allowed his boys to wash only 3 times a year. 3 frickin' times a year to remove carcinogenic waste embedded in their skin. When a child moved too slowly, perhaps because they were suffocating, motivation techniques were employed. The master might light a straw fire beneath them or burn a brimstone candle. If a boy showed signs of going off, that's period-appropriate language for losing consciousness, another apprentice would be sent up behind him to stick pins into his buttocks or feet. The greatest fear, getting stuck. Knees jammed against chin, the more they struggled, the tighter they became wedged. Hours might pass before extraction. If their struggles dislodged soot, they would suffocate in darkness. Dead or alive, removal often required dismantling the chimney brick by brick. In 1909, A Canadian publication interviewed James Seaward, who had somehow endured 58 years as a chimney sweep. He started at 6, an orphan with no protections, and his testimony burns with quiet rage. I was only 6 years old when I went up my first chimney. I was an orphan and I fell into the hands of a chimney sweep, and a cruel master he was. I have known what it was to have straw lighted under me and pins stuck into the soles of my feet to force me up a chimney. And I have known, too, what it was to come down covered with blood and soot after climbing with my knees and elbows. Sometimes I used to have to stay up a difficult chimney 5 or 6 hours at a stretch. Seaward wasn't just a survivor, he was a statistical anomaly who rose to become alderman of Wokingham's Borough Council. From chimney to council chambers, a transformative journey few of his peers lived to experience. The 19th century saw gradual legislative awakening, but chimney sweeps weren't even important enough to merit their own protections. They were swept up in general child labour laws, their suffering a footnote rather than a headline. The Chimney Sweepers Act of 1834 made it illegal for anyone under 10 to be apprenticed, but enforcement was laughable, much like today's so-called enforcement of laws related to child abuse. Not until Lord Shaftesbury's persistent parliamentary crusade in 1875 did enforceable legislation finally arrive. What's most disturbing is the proximity to comfort. These weren't children working distant coal mines or anonymous factories. They were inside people's homes, the most intimate spaces of family life. Households literally built their warmth around the suffering of children, repurposed as tools. Technology eventually solved what morality couldn't. Joseph Glass's system of canes and brushes eliminated the need for climbing boys, but the technical solution existed a century before the practice was eliminated. The delay wasn't about capability, it was about caring. Orphans were the perfect victims. No defenders, no one to protest the bruises, burns, respiratory diseases or cancers. No one to notice when they disappeared entirely. They were expendable bodies in service to comfort, hidden in the walls where the privileged wouldn't have to acknowledge their existence. We tell ourselves these stories are history, safely contained in museum exhibits. But the essential calculation remains: whose bodies are expendable in service to comfort? Whose suffering is acceptable if it remains hidden? What convenient blind spots do we maintain because looking would require action? 6 years old, the darkness of the chimney, the burning sensation of brine on raw flesh, the pins in the soles of feet, the struggle to breathe. These weren't abstract concepts. They were the daily reality for thousands of children whose suffering heated the drawing rooms of progress. Next time you see smoke rising from a chimney against a winter sky, spare a thought for the children who once inhabited that darkness. Their ghosts still climb the flues of our collective memory. If only we have the courage to look up and acknowledge them. I truly appreciate your time. May kindness follow you like a shadow and light fill every step of your journey. Peace!